In this discussion, our main concern is to narrate the story of how the Congress, after a period of relative ennui, which followed the withdrawal of the non-cooperation, plunged into another round of mass movements against British rule during the early 1930s. We are talking about the Civil Disobedience Campaign, which was, as you all know, one of the more significant episodes in the history of the national movement. Regarding civil disobedience, however, the historical opinions are more nuanced. Historians have talked about the manner in which the civil disobedience actually made a significant progress on what had been left behind by the non-cooperation. Business classes, for that matter, actually participated more enthusiastically, at least in the early phase of the civil disobedience movement. But scholars like Shumit Sharkar and many other historians as well have often debated over whether the civil disobedience campaign can be studied or seen as an unqualified advance on the non-cooperation.
So, how does Shumit Sharkar and the other historians distinguish between the civil disobedience movement and the non-cooperation movement?
Yeah, that is basically the question that they are raising. If you come across the standard nationalist historiography, that these are all stages through which the national movement passed, eventually reaching a very high point in the 1940s. 42 movement has been always cited as one of those great turnarounds in Indian history. Some people would go to the extent of describing that as a spontaneous revolution. But Sarkar and others are arguing that in many respects, civil disobedience actually had shown indications of a number of fissures within India's body politic. For that matter, even if the business classes were very enthusiastic in supporting the Congress in the civil disobedience campaign in the early stage, when it threatened to grow into a more radical kind of a mobilization in the later stages, they began to advise Gandhi to arrive at a compromise. Women's participation was remarkable during the civil disobedience movement. They were participating in the movement in large number, not just women in the high places, but also ordinary women. But if you look at Muslim participation, it was very paltry. The strength of the Congress organization in the rural areas was derived from the kind of mobilization that had taken place already among the richer and the propertied peasantry. But unlike during the non-cooperation, when even the lower peasantry became associated, often through spontaneous movements, the civil disobedience actually showed a very controlled movement, a movement which was more effectively controlled by the Congress organizations. It had its advantages, but at the same time, it actually prevented the kind of spread effect that you come across during the non-cooperation. We are talking about the very lukewarm Muslim response, and this had something to do with the growing communalization of politics in the course of the 1920s. From 1926-27 onwards, there were frequent riots in different parts of India, and that stood as a barrier to the kind of communal cooperation that we had seen during the non-cooperation movement. Because of the revolution in Turkey, which abolished the caliphate and made khilafat a completely irrelevant issue. So the point that we would like to emphasize, partly actually reiterating the stand taken by several historians who had worked on this area, that certainly civil disobedience had shown the ability on the part of the Congress organization to renew the agitation, and the agitation actually showed remarkable control of the organization over the movement. But at the same time, despite the involvement of women, despite the involvement of even teenagers in large number in the movement, we see certain tendencies which did not have good portents for India's future political evolution, particularly the alienation of the Muslims. Now, saying this, it is important to look at civil disobedience in terms of a historical sequence. I mean, one can take the withdrawal of the movement at Chauri Chaura as the point of departure. You know how the withdrawal of the movement had created considerable disillusionment among congressmen. The radical congressmen were completely baffled by Gandhi's decision, even though Gandhi, from his own standpoint, was correct in upholding the stand that if the ordinary participants in the movement were actually failing to adhere to the nonviolent principles. Now, from about the time when the non-cooperation movement was withdrawn until 1927, when a renewed spark of agitation began to be seen with the anti-Simon Commission agitation, it was a period of relative lull. Political life was dull, and there was an element of despondency as well.
Excuse me, sir. Why was it that the Simon Commission created so much resentment among the Indian politicians?
It created the resentment because of the kind of indifference that was shown by the British government, which sent the Simon Commission to India towards Indian political demands. The manner in which the commission was constituted, it was an all-white commission constituted by Englishmen, and no Indian was made a member of the Simon Commission, which was actually going into the complexities of the constitutional question in order to suggest measures to resolve them. So that was certainly one of the main reasons why the Simon Commission was creating so much of resentment and evoked opposition. Before the Simon Commission was actually appointed by the government, in order to rectify the inadequacies of the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, the congressmen decided to participate in the council, at least for some time. Say, the movement was withdrawn at Chauri Chaura, and the congressmen who wished to participate in the council in order to wreck it from within, to use the words of those congressmen like Motilal Nehru or Chittaranjan Das, who formed the Swarajya Party in order to participate in the council elections, because the Congress officially would not allow its members to go into these reformed councils. The Swarajya Party created a lot of enthusiasm. C.R. Das became the mayor of Calcutta Corporation, appointed Subhash Chandra Bose, his lieutenant, as the chief executive officer. Motilal Nehru's son, Jawaharlal, then a young politician, became the chairman of the Allahabad municipality. So men who became associated with the Swarajya Party wished to become important functionaries in representative bodies. With time, the Swarajya Party began to lose its steam. Even though in the earlier election they performed very well, but in the elections of 1926 their performance was not very impressive. So it seems that after the death of C.R. Das and after the growing disillusionment among congressmen about British intentions, the trust in the British commitment was actually lacking among Indian politicians. So at this juncture, when they decided to send the Simon Commission to India, they became suspicious. The congressmen felt that the British were not actually adequately responsive to the Congress demand for dominion status, Congress demand for some kind of self-government. In the Congress session in 1927, the decision was taken to boycott the Simon Commission. And that triggered the renewal of a new phase of agitation in India. And the Simon Commission agitation took place in most of the cities. And in one such occasion, when there was a demonstration happening in Lahore, one of the very respectable old leaders of the Congress, Lajpat Rai, suffered injury and eventually he died. So the Simon Commission agitation can be seen as an important turning point, which was actually preparing the ground for a major campaign in 1930. But there was another campaign as well, something which was limited among the peasants, limited in one region known as the Bardoli Satyagraha. In 1928, with that Satyagraha, Gandhi once again returned to the mainstream of Congress politics. So Congress, alongside rejecting the Simon Commission, asked Motilal Nehru and Tez Bahadur Sapru to draft an alternative constitution. It is known as the Nehru Report, which was finally tabled in the Congress, which actually sketched a particular constitutional structure. There were disagreements, of course, with the Muslim League leaders like Jinnah, but eventually the Nehru Report was drafted and tabled before the Congress. And the Congress, on the basis of that Nehru Report, wanted the negotiations with the government. The government all along had shown a complete indifference to such demands. So by 1928-29, you can see rumblings of discontent within the Congress about the intentions of the colonial state. Some of the radical young politicians like Jawaharlal Nehru or Subhash Chandra Bose in Calcutta, they were unhappy with this limited demand for dominion status. They wanted complete independence. So that in 1929, when the Congress session met at Lahore, they decided in favor of Purna Swaraj. Complete independence resolution was adopted in the Congress session at Lahore in 1929. Much against Gandhi's wishes. Gandhi still wanted to follow a very cautious line. But the condition in India was such that this kind of radicalization of politics was unstoppable. People were not very happy with the way the government was treating the Indian politicians. The way Simon Commission completely ignored Indian representation. The way the government was actually silent about what they were exactly going to do with the constitution. But apart from this, there are other reasons as well, social reasons. Reasons caused by the depression. The depression was responsible for a downswing in prices which had affected the peasants very substantially. And that was one reason why the substantial and the propertied peasantry were resentful about the taxation of the government. They were in favor of lowering down of taxes, and no revenue campaign or a no rent campaign was likely to be popular among them. There was labor militancy in 1928-29, particularly when the depression hit the Indian economy. There were layoffs, strikes became more frequent. So you have a larger context of peasant resentment about revenue in the larger context of declining agricultural prices, working class resentment caused by layoffs and retrenchment, wage cuts. Among the trade unions, there was a clear tendency of being influenced by communism. Girni Kamgar Union in Bombay, for example, came to be influenced increasingly by the Marxists. Even in Bengal, the communists were actually gradually making inroads into the working class movement. So there was an element of radicalization in Indian politics at that time because of a number of other factors outside of the orbit of Congress politics. If you look at the Congress, you see a certain force developing from within the Congress which wished to follow a more radical line of action. It is in this context, it was difficult for Gandhi also to keep these radical tendencies in check. So Gandhi arrived at a compromise. Gandhi persuaded the Congress to accept the Nehru Report, which is the draft constitution formulated or drafted by Motilal, mainly in association with Tej Bahadur Sapru, a liberal. But in order to disarm the more radically inclined congressman, the young congressman, he also suggested that if the government was unwilling to accept this report as the basis of the new constitution, then the Congress would plunge into a new phase of movement. So 26 January 1930 was celebrated as the Independence Day. And that was the turning point. And when Gandhi realized that the Viceroy Irwin was not going to respond to his overtures, he decided that the time had come for the Congress to start the Civil Disobedience Movement. That is the civil disobedience, the backdrop. But then, in his own cautious style, Gandhi wanted to move slowly. in order to allow adequate preparations for the movement, in order to allow the Congress organizations to tighten up their organizational control over the followers, particularly in the rural areas. So he began with a modest aim of violating and breaking the salt law, the monopoly that the government had on salt production, arguing by breaking the salt law, he would start the civil disobedience. And this is during March, April 1930. Salt certainly was a very important symbol.
So why did Gandhi choose this incident of breaking the salt law as the initiation of the civil disobedience movement?
In the first place, it fits in with Gandhi's overall strategy of moving slowly. An issue which will enable him to organize movements in different parts of India on a rather small scale. But it was at the same time a very sensitive issue, because salt was a daily necessity. And the Indians wanted the right to produce salt. That was the only way they would not actually pay these taxes, which were taken by government through their control over salt production. That was the reason. It became a very popular kind of a symbol, appealing to the poorer classes. So that was the reason why breaking the salt law was the point of entry into a new phase of campaign. But as you know, civil disobedience movement in many pockets did not actually conform to these Gandhian limits. You will look at Chittagong, for example. In the backdrop of the civil disobedience movement, the famous Chittagong Armory raid took place, which signaled the beginning of a renewed phase of revolutionary unrest in Bengal. In Punjab, the Hindustan Social Republican Army, in Punjab and North India, were renewing a third, final phase of revolutionary movement. That was the time. This was the larger context in which civil disobedience in many places did not actually conform to the kind of limits that Gandhi has suggested. Look at Peshawar. For the first time, the northwestern frontier provinces came within the orbit of Gandhian mobilization, led by a man called Abdul Ghaffar Khan, known as Frontier Gandhi, a devoted follower of Gandhi, who came to the Congress session in Lahore with a large number of Pathan followers. But then, in the northwestern frontier provinces, violent incidents took place, leading to the death of as many as 250 people. Sholapur was another storm center during the civil disobedience movement, where the textile workers went on the rampage, causing violence. Surja Sen, the leader of the Chittagong Armory raid, was a congressman, was the secretary of the district congress, who participated in the salt march in Chittagong, we know the seaside Chittagong port. But then at the same time, even as he was participating, preparing the district congress for participation in the salt march, he was also creating this nucleus of revolutionaries who are going to achieve prominence almost around the same time in April 1930 by raiding the Chittagong Armory. So it is not as if that always these storm centers of civil disobedience followed what Gandhi had asked them to do. But by and large, if you look at the movement, except for some of these regions which I have already mentioned, it followed the Gandhian line. Mainly a control movement in which the rich peasants were participating. And ultimately, around September 1930, we see the movement in a declining state. Involvement of the peasants notwithstanding, the peasants were becoming tired. The business people influenced Gandhi or tried to advise Gandhi to arrive at a compromise. And the government was also moving in a certain direction. The government convened the Round Table Conference in London. In the first conference, Congress was not represented. Most of the congressmen were in prison. So the Round Table Conference didn't produce anything. British government actually adopted the divisive strategy, as Ramsay MacDonald announced that famous MacDonald Award, known also as Communal Award. He suggested a constitutional reforms proposal, and among these reform proposals included separate electorate for the Muslims, separate electorate for the lower castes. So the government was also trying to create divisions in Indian political life through such kinds of manipulations of constitutional provisions, by giving the Muslims reservations, by giving the lower caste reservations in electoral bodies. So it is in these circumstances, after much persuasion, after the liberals persuaded Gandhi to at least work out a compromise with the government, after the business people who had become tired by then, or who had, according to some historians, become threatened by the possibility of this movement growing into a massive revolutionary upsurge, a massive labor militancy in the industrial areas, advising Gandhi, therefore, to arrive at a compromise, Gandhi decided to come to a kind of a truce with Irwin, known as the Gandhi-Irwin pact, and agreed to participate in the Round Table Conference. He went to London to participate in the Round Table Conference, but came back to India empty-handed. We are all familiar with the story of how ultimately this led to the renewal of the second phase of the civil disobedience movement. By the time Gandhi returned from the Round Table Conference, the movement had run its course. That kind of intensity that you come across in the earlier phase of the movement was lacking. The business classes, as I said, that they had become somewhat tired, or they had become apprehensive about labor militancy, the propertied peasantry. They wished to go back to their fields. So it is in this context that the second phase of civil disobedience movement showed signs of dissipation of the movement.
So, if there were so many discordant elements in the Indian national movement, then how can we make an assessment of the civil disobedience movement in the long-term history of the freedom struggle?
Well, that is very usual in national movements, or for that matter in the history of any major movements. Militancy cannot continue for an indefinite period. And this problem was faced by the Congress organization. You cannot ask the peasants to stay away from their normal activity for all time to come. Labor militancy would reach peak, and then once, if situation becomes favorable for them, laboring classes wouldn't participate in such activity. So it is not as if that any such movement of the sort that happened during the non-cooperation struggle or during the civil disobedience movement, that any such movement would continue for an indefinite period. But you know that civil disobedience managed to bring in women in large number. You have, yes?
Sir, I wanted to know the names of the important women leaders who distinguished themselves as important leaders in the civil disobedience movement.
During the civil disobedience movement, we come across the emergence of Vijayalakshmi Pandit, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. These are some of the more distinguished women leaders who became important in the Congress later. You come across participation by teenagers in large number. You have an arrest list where large number of teenaged people figured prominently. And as far as women were concerned, it's not just the upper class women, as I was saying. Peasant women were also involved in the civil disobedience campaign in large number. So it is not as if that the civil disobedience, despite its failure, was a non-starter. It managed to create a lot of enthusiasm. And as we try to wind up this discussion, we adopt a more nuanced view of the civil disobedience. We see how the mobilization took place, how the organization was so important, how gradually the movement petered out. In the gradual dissipation of the movement, government repression certainly was very significant, because Willingdon, Irwin's successor, adopted a more repressive policy. People were arrested in large number, their properties were attached. Repression under Willingdon became so severe that it became difficult to continue with the kind of movement that had started in 1930. So there was a need for compromise. Gandhi allowed individual satyagraha for some time, but then that individual satyagraha was suspended in 1933. After 1933, we see again the Congress participating in the elections, and on the basis of the massive power and control that the Congress had been able to achieve among the rural folks in many of the North Indian states, that the Congress managed to win the elections in 1937 in as many as 8 states handsomely. So if you say that return to constitutional politics showed how the Congress was primarily interested in constitutional politics without being really concerned about mass movement, it will be a very one-sided argument. They wished to eliminate foreign rule, so they had a limited objective of creating a nation state. And if you consider that to be the main objective of the Congress, then the idea that there should be pressures on the government and the readiness on the part of the Congress to come to a compromise in order to achieve power, that makes sense.